Hey everyone, I'm Grace Kwame. We're so happy to have you. We're having a talk here called the Theology of Technology, which is a topic I'm really interested in, having worked at Google now for 8 years in marketing and then at Apple for 21 years before that. And so I've always been interested in the intersection of faith and work and Christianity and technology. And so I'm so happy to have Paul here today to be talking on the subject. I wanted to thank also Daniel, Lim, and Alan, who are helping out with the technology behind this to make it happen, for those who are joining us via live stream, and Lucinda as well for helping with the slides. Thank you so much. A little bit about Paul. Paul's originally from Texas and came here to go to Stanford in 1995, where he studied engineering, and he decided he never wanted to leave. And so after that, he worked as a product manager for Oracle for 7 years. And then he went to seminary and joined PBCC Palo Alto staff as a pastor in 2007. And then he became an elder in 2014 and has been there ever since. His wife Rachel is here with us. They have 5 children, and he's been studying this topic of technology and theology for the past 7 or 8 years now, and has a big body of work on this topic. But since we just have an hour today, he's going to give us kind of the fundamentals, what he's learned is the very basics of when he's gone back to Genesis and studied technology from the very beginning. So I'll introduce him in a second, but for those who are on the live stream, we will be taking questions via the YouTube chat, so feel free to enter them there. And for those who are here in the audience, we'll have about 15 minutes in the end for questions, so feel free to be thinking about that. Without further ado, please welcome Paul Taylor.
Thanks, Grace, and thanks you guys for being here and having me. It's fun to be here, fun to talk about this topic. It's been a while since I've been here in Cupertino at PBC, so it's fun to see our brothers and sisters on this side of things. I was going to introduce myself, but Grace did such a great job. I'm trying to think if there's anything left to introduce, but I think not, so I'll jump in. We're going to talk about theology of technology, and if you're here because you have a lot of questions and are hoping for some answers, then you will likely be very disappointed. We're going to ask a lot of questions, we're going to really dive into this, but it's such a huge topic, and it's really an area where mostly my goal in working in this area in the last several years has been to help people ask questions, because I'm really convinced a lot of stuff happens when people don't ask questions, and so the asking, I think, is sometimes more important than the answering. So a better title might be something like Towards a Theology of Technology, that we're kind of hoping to move towards that, but we probably won't quite arrive at something full-fledged today. One of the ways I kind of started thinking about this is I often tell this story where in my house, we have the smart lights and everything, so you can control everything and turn it on and off and up and down. And so when we would do this, we do family movie night every Friday night. And we usually make pizza, and so we make pizza, and everybody gets their pizza, and we sit down in front of the TV, and we get ready to watch a movie, and I usually say, Alexa, turn on family dim. And all the lights go just bright enough to eat by, right? And then 10 or 15 minutes, we have our food, the movie's going, and then once we're done with our food, I say, Alexa, turn on family dark. And it goes dark. And then we watch the movie, and then after the movie's over, we get up and I say, Alexa, turn on family bright. And the room fills with light. And one time, as I was doing this, I realized that what I was doing is the same thing that the scriptures record God doing as his first act. That with the power of my voice, I was calling forth light and darkness. I was saying, in essence, let there be light, and there was light. This is what we hear God doing. Genesis 1:3, God said, let there be light, and there was light. And so this creative act that is exercised through voice is something that guides and establishes, characterizes God throughout the scriptures. And this is what I was participating in. And so I started wondering, what is that doing to me? Since I am doing something that God does, how does that change the way I think about myself? Is there anything happening within my soul, within my heart, because I'm acting like God in this way? And that got me starting to think about some of these issues along with some other situations. The question I started asking is, what is tech doing to us as people, as followers of Jesus? And I think this is a question a lot of people resonate with. As I started studying this, one of the things that became interesting to me is if you look at the rough history of the development of technology, you can very roughly, this is a very high-level division, but divide it into three main eras that are interesting. So in kind of the 17th, 18th, early 19th century, beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we started coming up with machines. We started coming up with agricultural equipment, the invention of the engine, and these devices really gave us a type of physical power that we hadn't had before as humans. So we increased our power. And then as things got progressing into the later 19th century, the 20th century, that's where we started to develop transportation and communication. And so automobiles, telephone, things like this. You could think about that maybe as increasing our presence. We were all of a sudden able to get from point A to point B a lot faster. And if we weren't in the same place, we were able to communicate across long distances much faster than we could ever do before. And then finally, in the later half of the 20th century and into today, we've developed this incredible information technology where we can collect information, we can store information, we can distribute information, we can sort it and search it in ways that has never been possible in the history of humanity. And so you can think about that in terms of knowledge. Our ability to comprehend and sort knowledge is increased. And you're probably kind of aware of where I'm going with these three categories. But if you think about these three categories, these are, of course, the three primary attributes of God. In any classical theism, we talk about God being all-powerful, all-present, and all-knowing. And so if we as humans have been increasing in each of those categories, if we are becoming more powerful, more present, and more knowledgeable, then it's fair to ask, are we becoming more like God? And in a sense, I think we are. Now, some people actually think that we will become God-like. So some of you may have heard or read an author named Yuval Harari. He's an Israeli philosopher. He's written in this area a lot. He's got a book called Homo Deus, and here's one of his suggestions. He says, having raised humanity above the beastly level of survival struggles, we will now aim to upgrade humans into gods and turn Homo sapiens into Homo Deus. His basic premise is that the way the ancients conceived of gods, that kind of power and authority that they wielded, is what we will become in short order. And he celebrates this. He thinks this is a good thing. We may or may not think otherwise. But this question then, is technology turning us into gods? If you think back to my story, there I am commanding Alexa with the power of my voice, acting as God to the environment around me. Is tech doing that to us? Is it infusing us with capabilities that we didn't have before? And what happens to our souls when we do that? What is really going on behind the scenes? So that's part of what I want to explore a little bit here right now. And to do that, what we have to do is I think we have to back up a little bit and start, rather than thinking about technology, with thinking about what it means to be human. So we'll be coming back to Psalm 8 several times in our time this afternoon, but let me read this for now. What is man that you are mindful of him? This psalm, one of the things it does is, in light of the glory of God, it asks the question about what really is humanity. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? This is kind of an incredulous question. Why, God, in all your glory, would you care about lowly mankind? And then the psalmist answers, yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. And so there's this interesting dichotomy within humanity of power and humility. And that's one of the dynamics we'll be exploring a little bit as we think about what humanity is. So here's my approach. Just 3 quick things we're going to talk about this afternoon, and then we'll take a bunch of questions. And if things come up, feel free. This is happy to be really casual. If you have a question or thought or I'm not making sense, feel free to raise your hand, and we can have some dialogue as well. I'll ask some questions throughout also. But I want to start by just giving some thoughts about a framework for how to think about who we are as humans, and then apply it a little bit to a few areas of technology, and then wrap up by just thinking about how Christ fits into all of this and who Jesus is and what he has to do with technology. Yeah, please. Yeah.
In your previous slide, you have power, presence, knowledge. We usually call that progress. And what is God's role in this kind of progress?
Yeah. That's a great question. I will get to that a little bit, but my basic premise, and I'll defend this a little bit later, but I'll go ahead and kind of state it right now, is that I believe God wants us to progress in these kinds of ways. I think that we were meant to create and develop and innovate. I think that's part of how we were made, and like I said, I'll defend that in a few minutes. So, in a sense, one of the things I started when I started thinking about this, one of my first articles I wrote on this was called "Becoming Better Gods," and I think that in a sense we are supposed to become better, small case G gods, and hopefully that'll make a little more sense in a question. But that's a great. Keep that. If I don't, I won't totally answer it. But if I don't address it, bring it up again. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of a framework. And what we're going to try and do is think about what it means to be human and have just a very basic, this is not going to be anything new for you, but hopefully it's putting the pieces together in a way that helps us then figure out how technology fits into our humanity. So first thing, what does it mean to be human? I have this idea that I've never done it, though I would like to. I'm going to get some summer interns to go do this and film it. But if you go down to downtown Palo Alto or downtown Cupertino, and if you walk up to the average person and say, do you worry at all that technology is destroying humanity? Or maybe be a little less dramatic, degrading our humanity or damaging our humanity. What do you think people would say? Average person. Any thoughts? I'm seeing head nods. Yes? Yeah, you think so? I think that's a pretty resonant idea, that the average person in our culture has fears about what technology is doing to our humanity. But then, if you follow up that question and you ask that same person, well, what does it mean to be human then? What do you think they'll say? What kinds of themes do you think people will bring up? If they're worried that our humanity is being degraded, they must have some notion that's being diminished. But what do you think they might mention? Go ahead and shout it out. Relationships, yep. War? Okay. A lack of presence, yep. So there's a degrading in the kind of our actual being with each other. Lack of focus. Emotions. Compassion, yeah. Some type of being able to relate to another person, empathy, compassion. I think it's a hard question. I think you're right. They'll talk about relationships, emotions, the kind of physicality, but in general, I think people don't have a clear sense of what it means to be human. And if you think about that, if it's a little bit of a disturbing scenario then. If everybody's worried that our humanity is being destroyed and yet nobody agrees or even can articulate, well, what is humanity, then you find we might have a situation to deal with. So what I'm going to try and do is have a brief framework for what it means to be human. So we start at the beginning. Most of you will be familiar with this verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So we're going to be assembling a little bit of a diagram to picture our humanity. So you have God and you have creation. And of course, the first thing to notice then is if we're turning to the scriptures to ask the question, what does it mean to be human? The first thing we notice is that the story doesn't start with humanity, right? First pages of the first words of the Bible do not mention humanity in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. So I'm the youngest of 3 children. My brother is 5 years older than me. My sister is 6 years older than me. Any other youngest children here? Yeah, John. Yeah, Brian. Does it ever annoy you when your older siblings talk about life before you? We'd be sitting around family times, and my family would reminisce about the days before I was born. And that just seemed, first of all, really poor form, right, as a family. But the idea that my family existed before I existed kind of was very threatening to me. How could there be a Taylor family before there was a Paul to be part of it? And yet when we turn to the scriptures, this is what we find. There is a God and there is a heavens and the earth before there is a man and a woman to occupy it. So in a very real sense, the story of creation is God's story, not our story. So if we're trying to build an anthropology, if we're trying to talk about what it means to be human, then we have to start with God, not with ourselves. So there's God and there's creation. And then, of course, the next part is that we do come into the picture. Eventually, we are inserted into God's story. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over." And then there's a whole series of things that mankind is given dominion over. So if we were to add us into our chart, then we would put us off to the side, and we somehow come in between God and his creation. So you'll notice that God speaks in authority over humanity. Let us make man. We are a creation of God's, and yet we exist in dominion over the rest of his creation. So remember back, we have this dual notion then of humility and dominion and power. So if we think about this, we might say that in this image then, we were created to serve God and rule over creation. One of the ways I sometimes articulate this is that we were created to be as gods to God's creation. We weren't created to be God, but we were created to represent him, to be as him to his creation. So if you're standing in the place of humanity looking down, then you are a ruler. You have dominion. You have authority. You have power. That is what it means to be human. If you're standing in the place of humanity looking up, you have humility. You have weakness. You are submissive. You serve. So somehow being human combines both of these aspects. We are created to be both servants and rulers. And that tension, that kind of creative, constant tension, I think is part of what it really means to be human. I think we find that in the first pages of the scriptures. And if you think through a lot of things that go wrong in the world, you can often track it to people serving when they ought to rule or ruling when they ought to serve. So we get confused about when we're supposed to be submissive and when we're supposed to submit or assert our authority. And when we do it in the wrong context, things get messed up. Any comments or questions? I'll just see if people are tracking any. Is this kind of making sense a little bit so far, or any pushback? Yeah, that's right. It's kind of a constant thing. we are doing both simultaneously. We are both servants and rulers at the same time. It kind of depends on where we're looking in the context. The story doesn't end here, though. There's a few more details to add. This contrast and tension, and then it turns out that this image is itself a diverse image. So as the story progresses, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So now the image that is meant to serve as God to his creation is now diversified. It's now distinguished, differentiated. And so the image itself doesn't just exist in relationship to God and the creation. The image has relationships with each other. There's male and female, and of course, there are other kinds of differences as well, ethnic and personality and geographical and background differences that come into play. But the image itself has been differentiated. So if you take this just basic idea then, you might say that there are, my lining up got messed up here. But you might say that there are 4 basic relationships that define us as humans. First of all, there is this under relationship that we exist under God. There is an over relationship. We exist over creation. There is a with relationship. We exist with the other images that we co-serve alongside. And then there is, for lack of a better word, I call the unto relationship. And we'll expand this in a minute, but this is the relationship that I have with myself, in a sense. And if we think about this, that we exist under God, over creation, with each other, and unto ourselves, this kind of 4-fold model I have found very helpful, and we'll start unpacking this a little bit in thinking about who we are, but also how technology fits in. So remember, again, Psalm 8, what is man? You have made him a little lower. And if you think back to Psalm 8, what is man? You've made him a little lower, and yet you have crowned him with glory. And so you see this kind of differentiation of under and over within Psalm 8. And if we think about these categories then, this is messed up as well. Sorry about this. God created us under God. This is essentially our worship life. When we are oriented towards God, we orient ourselves in worship, submission, service. When we are over creation, this is our vocational identity. We are charged with some responsibility to steward, to shepherd, to go into creation. I think we are given the task to both work and manage it, to make creation more fruitful than it is without us. In fact, this was one of the first commands given in the book of Genesis, is for mankind, men and women, to work the ground and to make it produce more fruit. And so a little bit to your point of progress, that we are made to step into the creative world that God has wrought, and we are made to improve it, to increase its productivity and fruitfulness. That's our vocational nature. With each other, that's the relationship that we are made essentially to have relationships with another person, with other people. And then unto ourselves, we have some notion that our identity is important. And if you think about those 4 categories, then we have an identity, we have a relationship, we have a vocation, and we have worship. I find those categories really helpful for just thinking about humanity in kind of a holistic sense. This is what it means to be human. It's not maybe a comprehensive picture, but I think it hits most of the major categories. Yeah. Keep Brian running.
If I had a card, I'd have more power to do this quickly.
That's right. You see?
I'm stuck on one little part.
Okay.
There's animals, and animals are just a little bit of our image, and we do have relationships with them.
Uh-huh.
So how do they fit in your model?
That's a good question. I mean, again, I can't claim this to be a comprehensive everything, but I would say animals fit in the creation. So we are over animals. We have a responsibility to to manage, to shepherd, to steward, to care for animals as part of the created order. And certainly, I mean,
animals are a little bit like us.
they're a little bit like us, some of them more than others. Our dog is very like us. And so that's a good question. Maybe there's a animate creation and an inanimate creation, or that's a good differentiation. I'll have to think on that one a little bit more. I don't know. What do you think? Where does it fit?
Question back to me.
Yeah.
I think there's some mystery here that I don't understand. I mean, we share a vast amount of DNA, for example, with a banana or a chimpanzee. So
Yeah.
when God created us, he did it in some mysterious way, and the animals seem to be a vague image of us.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't have a good answer. That's why I wanted you to answer.
Well, thinking about image is an important word, and I didn't go all the way into this, but people have thought about what it means to be the image of God in a lot of different ways. And so one of the ways is kind of like your essence, or to use a fancy word, ontology. Like, I am the image of God because I'm similar to him. But there's another way that people talk about image that is more of a functional image. So in that sense, image is more of a verb than a noun. So I am created in order to image God, to act like he acts. And in that sense, I would say animals don't seem to be our images. They don't seem to, the higher level animals don't seem to have any concern for the lower level animals, to shepherd them or steward them or manage them wisely. The kind of responsibility to innovate and create, you don't really see that in the animal kingdom. I'm trying to think if my dog bears that true. I would say mostly he destroys rather than creates. We have a remote control budget in our house that I'll just have them on auto order on Amazon because he destroys all of our remote controls, so they just keep shipping them. It's a good question though, thank you, yeah. Okay, so we have a basic framework of humanity then. So I said we were going to talk about technology then. So then the question is, how does technology fit into this framework? And does this help us at all? Hopefully it does. Help us to think about the role of technology and how it affects our humanity. How does technology fit in? Well, here's my very rough working definition of technology. And there's a lot of people who have made definitions of technology, so this is in kind of the broadest level. Technology is something we create to extend our natural capability. Something we create to extend our natural capability. And let me unpack this a little bit. So technology is a something. It is a thing that exists. Notice I don't say it has to be a physical something. So for instance, government is something. Structures of government are, according to this definition, a technology. But it is something that we create. So it is something that doesn't already exist. I like to say that a rock is not technology. But if I tie a stick to it, it becomes technology. Because I have created something new. I have created something. And with a rock, I can hit something else. I can hit another rock. I can hit a nail if I need to. But as soon as I tie a stick to it, I can do that more efficiently. Now I have, what's that in physics? The fulcrum, the torque, lever, etc. So technology doesn't allow us to do something we couldn't do before. It just allows us to extend our capability. So even transportation, I can get from here to there. I can do that without technology. But with technology, I can do it faster or better. I can talk to you. I can talk to John across a distance. But with technology, I can talk across a wider distance. So it's something that extends our capability rather than giving us fundamentally new capabilities. When I first started writing about this and thinking about this, I had some people helping me, and one of them accused me in my writing. He came up with an acronym, what was it, EAAT. everything as a technology. He said, your definition is too broad because everything is a technology, which is a fair criticism of this definition. But any government, any economic structures, any devices, language itself, all of these things are technologies then that we create that extend our capabilities. Now, in general, the ones that we tend to be interested in today are things that focus on extending this relationship, the over relationship. In general, when we think of technology, we think of physical devices, mostly that you have to charge or they run out of batteries. We think of devices that extend our capability over creation in some ways. Now, actually, I think technology can fit in all of those four dotted lines, that technology actually can mediate and change each of those relationships. But for the sake of this conversation, we're going to focus on how it extends our overness over creation. And so it helps us to do things like be more powerful, be more present, be more knowledgeable, those kinds of things. So if that's the case, then I want to suggest then if we are supposed to, if technology is something that extends our ability to shepherd and steward creation, then I think we were meant to create technology. Now, you are certainly free to disagree with this, and I'll make my case. You can respond in a minute, but here's one of the reasons. I think there's actually a lot of reasons that lead me to believe this, but this is an interesting verse. So Genesis 1:21. I want you to imagine this scene. God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Genesis 1:21. So this is the account of the creation of two kinds of animals, sea creatures and winged birds that could fly. If you think about it, what is interesting about these two kinds of creatures? Why would they be called out in all the pages of creation that these categories are described? And my suggestion is that these are the two kinds of creatures that occupy the realms that we don't occupy, that we have trouble occupying. So we have a fairly limited ability to swim and to occupy the waters, and we have a fairly limited ability to fly and to occupy the skies. And so if you think about God calling out the fact, think about the early people reading Genesis, and God says, I created the birds, and I created the fish, and you're in charge of them. You're my image. You're supposed to be responsible for these creatures. And yet, they live in realms that are essentially inaccessible to you. What would be your inclination? Figure out a way to get to them, right? If I'm going to be responsible, if God's going to call out, hey, here are these creatures that exist in places you can't get to, isn't there something within the human spirit that's going to say, how can I figure it out to get there? I think God is loading creation with this yearning to create and innovate. So here's a quote. I don't think it's on my slide. Here's a quote from Wilbur Wright, who, of course, of the Wright brothers. He said, the desire to fly is an idea handed down to us by our ancestors, who in their grueling travels across trackless lands in prehistoric times looked enviously on the birds soaring freely through space at full speed above all obstacles on the infinite highway of the air. And I think that's probably true. I think this is a statement I cannot defend, but I think for all of time, people have looked at the birds and thought, I want to fly. And the human spirit joins with that and says, let's figure out a way. And of course, we have. So I think we were meant then to create technology. Yeah. That's awesome.
Brings me into a contradiction.
Okay,
Because so I'm a research scientist and I develop artificial intelligence.
great.
So that means that actually I believe that given sufficient time, we can build an intelligence that's indistinguishable from you.
Uh-huh.
However, if you were to ask me, am I the sum total of my thoughts, emotions, and acts and beliefs, my Christian side would say no.
Yeah, there's more.
So but now I'm stuck.
Yeah.
I want an answer.
We're going to get to that. Let me pause that because we're actually going to modify our chart in a minute, and I'm going to get to the topic of AI, and I think that's going to at least give you more questions, if not answer any of your existing ones. Any other thoughts or comments on this idea? Awesome. All right. So my suggestion then is, if we think about humanity, and this is, Brian, to your point about don't we do these things simultaneously? I think we flourish as humans when each of these relational connections aren't just kept, but they're kept in tension. I think there's a creative tension, a healthy tension within me when I have to serve and rule simultaneously. And that when one of those things starts to lag, there's something about my humanity that is made deficient or diminished. So the example I like to use is the tin can telephone, right? You know, you're familiar with this, where you take a tin can and you put a string between them, and if the string is kept taut, you can actually talk over vast distances. I think it's not in my notes, actually. I looked up the world's longest tin can telephone. I think it was like 469 feet or something. So people like spread it out over 2 houses, and they got Guinness to come and do the Guinness World Records and everything. But this tension allows for communication between the nodes, if you will. And I think that this chart, that we work best when there is a healthy tension between who I am, how I relate to others, how I worship God, and how I serve His creation. And you can probably, if I ask you, think of people who maybe allow one of those relationships to get dominant and the others start to fall away. You know, people, all they care about, even, worship's a great thing, but if all they're doing is worshiping, they have no sense of identity, no relationships, no vocation, there's something deficient. If all they care about is how can I control creation and manage this world, and they have no sense of identity, no sense of worship, then something's deficient. You can think about how each of these actually together grounds us in what it means to be human. Then if that's the case, one of the dangers then of technology is that technology, if it's strengthening one of those wires, has the potential to throw us off balance, to take away the creative tension between those various elements. And we're not going to go into all of this, but I have found this basic framework to be helpful, because you could kind of imagine several roads we could go down now, where I could say, let's think about how technology affects the unto ourselves. Let's think about how the technology we live among affects our identity and the way we think about ourselves. And that would be a fruitful path to walk down for the next 30 minutes. Or how does technology affect our withness with other people? How does it change the way we relate to others? And we could walk down that road. So each of these paths is a kind of an area where you could imagine you could really think through the implications of technology on this relationship and how it either strengthens or weakens that. What we're going to do is talk about 2 different areas of application that, just because I'm the one in charge, that's what I picked. So we're going to talk about 2 topics, though, as I said, this framework has a lot of potential for a lot of different things. First thing, this is the basic question: how does our use of technology affect these relationships? And I want to talk about the difference between being a creator and being a consumer. So if we were meant to be as God to His creation, and if we were meant to let's use the idea of the image as an active, functional role. If we're meant to image God over his creation, then we're meant to do something. And essentially, we were meant, one of the things God does is he's a creator. He is an innovator. He generates things. And so we were meant to be creators. And other people have used this distinction, but a lot of our technology puts us in the role of consumers. Although if you start to think about it, I remember a time years ago, maybe our kids were kind of little, and we bought, I think it was an iPad at the time, and we had this conversation with them, and we said, we want this piece of technology to be used by you to create, not to consume. And most technology is really capable of doing both. That with great technology, you can use it to create amazing things, or you can sit and stream Netflix on it, right? And just consume content. So if you think about it, maybe it's not actually the tech that's the problem. Maybe the technology itself is not the thing that's causing us to become consumers. Here's an article from MIT Press. They say, over the course of the 20th century, capitalism preserved its momentum by molding the ordinary person into a consumer with an unquenchable thirst for more stuff. And this actually gets back to your question about progress. I actually recently read, I'm in a doctoral program, and I read this work by a theologian who believes that progress has become the modern religion. That we believe in progress as an end of itself instead of what you're progressing for, which as Christians, we believe that we are meant to steward God's creation. We should be getting better at that, but the getting better is for the sake of becoming better stewards, not for the sake of the progress itself. So perhaps it's our system, our culture, that is shaping tech into something that creates us into consumers. We're going to move on. That's kind of one general big idea. We could dive more into that. So does our tech serve us then, or do we serve our tech? Actually, one more thought on this. We could think about how Jesus said in Mark, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And this might blow up some categories, but the Sabbath, I would argue, if you think back to my definition, is a technology. The Sabbath is something that God instructed us to create in order to extend our capabilities of rest. And he would say then that the Sabbath is meant to accomplish something. It's meant to do something for humankind. It's not that humankind does something for Sabbath. We're not serving the Sabbath. The Sabbath is meant to serve us. One more little area. This is to your question about AI. So this chart that I've made, actually, I've got about 10 or 12 alternate charts that I've developed in terms of when things go awry. And so here's one of them. This is actually not completely awry, but one of the things that I think we find is that we are given stewardship over creation, but we actually find that the creation we're told to steward is difficult to steward. It fights back. You might think of the thorns and thistles from Genesis 3. And so what we do, and what we have a tendency to do, is create an alternate creation that is far more amenable to our efforts at stewardship. And then, in order to steward that creation, we create images of ourselves that we put in charge to steward over that creation. So one of the areas you might think about this is, of course, AI. So we create alternate images of ourselves that share a lot of our essential nature that we then put in charge over creation. You could think about this in terms of social media, where it's a lot easier to control how people view me online than in a room full of actual people. So let's create an online world where I can curate myself and create an image of myself that I have far more control over than I do in the real world. So the encouragement then, or the danger here, is to, this is anybody familiar with DALL-E? Yeah. So this is one of these image generators. I did this a few weeks ago. I typed in this sentence: show me a pointillist painting showing a waterfall with shade trees all around and a bison eating grass. And about 20 seconds later, I had this. Is that right? What's it called? Mid-Journey. Okay, I'll check it out. Here's another one. This is just fun. I said, a mosaic of a waterfall on Mars. As far as we know, there isn't water on Mars, but that didn't seem to bother the digital artist. So we're creating worlds that we can control, that are easier to control than our own world. The question then, that the danger is that we can use technology then to escape our own world and live in another world. And I would argue, if we're going to construct some type of ethic from this model, then technology can be helpful in creating alternate frameworks where we can become better at managing our own world, but we need to use what we learned there to return to reality rather than living in this alternate creation. We're about out of time, but let me just really briefly, it seems bad to be brief on Christ. Nonetheless, if we're thinking about theology, we always have to come back to Christ, because really all theology is Christology. Christ is the center of everything in terms of when we're thinking about God, when we're thinking about creation, when we're thinking about the world, everything has to move through the person of Jesus Christ. He is the center of God's creative efforts here in the world. And so any theology we construct has to be some form of a Christology as well. We've been in Psalm 8 for a little bit. And if we're talking about what it means to be human, then we have to think of Christ as our model. So if the model that I've constructed of what it means to be human is to be of use, then we have to say that Christ did this. And I think it works out. I think if you were to look through the Gospels and look through the life and ministry and death and resurrection of Christ, I think it actually lines up really nicely. How you could see how Christ fulfills the underness, the overness, the withness, and the untoness. That Christ really fulfills this perfect model of what it means to be human in a biblical sense. And if we think about Christ in technology, I'll kind of end with this, but you can call Jesus a technologist. Jesus created technology as a carpenter. He would have created things that would be of use to people. He used technology as a fisherman. Fishing poles, boats would all classify as technology. He taught on technology. Actually, a tax is a technology, according to my very broad definition. And so he taught about how to use technology in a cultural system. He criticized technology. You can recall him criticizing the temple buildings and people's fascination with technology. He praised technology. You can remember him speaking of a builder who chose an appropriate building method for building that would withstand storms. And finally, he suffered and died under the forces of technology. The cross itself was a form of execution technology, and there's a whole, we could talk about execution technologies for a long time, actually. There's a lot of them, and the cross is one of the worst. It's one of the pinnacles of inhumane ways to kill a person. So he suffered under technology as well. All of this means that I think Christ can help us. Christ may not have used social media, he may not have had an iPhone, but he is familiar with how technology changes what it means to be human. He's familiar with the costs of it, the benefits of it, and what it looks like to live in a culture that's fascinated with it as well. So just my closing exhortation, and we'll have lots of time now for question and answer, is just hopefully these thoughts have given you a little bit of a framework to ask even more questions. My hope, and I know probably many of you are technologists, I don't presume to have an answer for theology of technology. I just think we need to be asking these kinds of questions. That as Christians, if we're building technology, we should be thoughtful and mindful about the effects of the things we're creating and using have on us, and that we should be in creative dialogue with each other and other practitioners and pastors and theologians and biblical scholars to figure out how all of this fits together. So keep asking questions. That's my exhortation, which flows nicely into a time of question and answer. So what do you guys think? Questions, thoughts?
I'm surprised you didn't address, there's this sub-community is trying to get beyond it's called transhumanism.
Yes. And there is a Christian association, the Christian Transhumanist Association.
I find it very suspect, but I'm just curious how that fits into your model.
Yeah. So transhumanism is basically the effort to kind of progress humanity to the point of almost deification. Yuval Harari, who I quoted earlier, would probably qualify himself as a transhumanist. There is a Christian version. I actually have a few friends in the Christian Transhumanist Association who believe, as Christians, that technology will be the vehicle through which God uses to essentially usher in the new creation, which personally I think to be misguided, but an interesting take on things. I think what transhumanists miss is the biblical value of limitation. And so one of the ways that I see happening within creation, we didn't go into this aspect of it, but as God creates us in the midst of these four relationships, I believe he gives us what I call constrained potential. So if you think about, again, that there's a tension there, that we have potential. If you think about, again, my example of the birds and the fish, we have made incredible progress in terms of flight and underwater exploration. And yet, there are parts of the ocean we've explored minuscule percentages of it. And there is a world of the heavens and the space that we barely explored anything. And so there's this incredible potential we have to make progress, but there's also this constraint. And I believe as you read, particularly the creation account, the limitations God gives us are actually gifts to us, that we are meant to thrive within a limited environment. And so I think the effort in transhumanism says we want to transcend the constraints of humanity, and I think God's call for us is to stretch the constraints of humanity, not to transcend them. At the same time, let me say one last thing. I'm also not worried about transhumanists because the end of the story of the garden has God posting an angel with a flaming sword to prevent his limits from being transcended. And so I think essentially transhumanists, it's not as if we have to worry that they might accidentally transcend God's limits. God is fully capable of defending his limitations. So I'm not worried that we're going to accidentally break the system. Yeah, some other questions.
I see parallels with what you've described. As a coach of a high school robotics team, we try to convey the idea that we get to explore and be creative in giving life in a very humble way, a device with software that we type life into instead of speaking life into. And I think the students come away with what you just described. It's a very humbling endeavor because it's very hard to do. It's very hard to make something that actually works.
Right.
And I think they come away with an admiration for what God has accomplished. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's not just this little thing. He's made me.
Right.
It's amazing. So I think that there's value in confronting our limitations because it helps us understand God's greatness even more.
Absolutely. And I would actually argue that we do this. I would say this represents your high school robotics team. Sorry, where is it? Right here. And if you think about what you're doing with high schoolers, is you're teaching them that they live under certain constraints. There are only certain things you can do with limitations of physics, and yet they're trying to create something else to control their created order, and they're doing it on a team of people. So they're figuring out their own skills, they're working with people, they're working under constraints, and they're trying to assert authority. And so you've constructed kind of a safe environment for them to grow in each of those four areas. and then hopefully to take those back into life itself. And kind of, so there's all sorts of these areas that we, I think, create this kind of a laboratory structure to grow in these relationships that then benefit us in life. John, I think you had a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you have an example of some technology that extends our relationship with God. And by technology, I'm going to narrow it
Oh
to
boy.
a thing, not a practice like Sabbath or worship. But do you have an example of some technology, some concrete technology that supports our relationship under God?
Yeah, I mean, lots of examples you could go to. I mean, you could go back to the printing press itself. The printing press is a unleashed, most historians would say the printing press led to the Reformation. Pretty direct line from A to B there. So in terms of allowing thoughts to permeate and pervade society and generate dialogue, and for one person to hear the thoughts of another, the printing press kind of allowed the environment that led to the Reformation and the Enlightenment, for that matter. You have a follow-up thought?
Well, that feels a little more like our relationship with other people.
Yeah.
I'm wondering more about our personal relationship with God.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, yeah, accordance, is that what Brian said? And Bible app, I mean, that's something I use that facilitates my relationship with God. It doesn't create my relationship with God. I could relate to God before then. And you could probably make the argument that it takes something away from my relationship with God. So certainly I think technology is always complicated. It extends, but sometimes it diminishes as well. Maybe underlying your question is, is there a way that prior to certain technologies, our relationship with God was limited and now we're freer to experience Him? That's probably a good point to push on. Like, I'm not sure we've gotten better at relating to God because of any technology, but certainly I think there's technology that has helped. There's a tension there. It's a great question, though. Yeah. Yeah, in fact, a lot of Christian historians will make the point that the moment in time when Jesus came and the gospel came was perfectly timed because the transportation technology of the ancient world had gotten to such a point where the gospel could go forth. Whereas if Jesus had come 200 years prior, there were no roads for the Apostle Paul to travel to get anywhere. And so the technology the Romans built in terms of roads and transportation and safe passage actually facilitated the communication of the gospel. It's not exactly what you're saying, but that's along the same lines.
Maybe one more question.
I guess I have an opposite question. So Palo Alto's message today was about the Exodus story, how the magicians were able to recreate God's signs. And I worry if technology does that. Like, people see technology doing things that only God could do before, and we start sort of trusting more in that and less relying on God. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that would fall into the category of kind of as we're getting better and better at doing things that we attribute to God, then do we find ourselves convinced that He's not needed or not existent? That's basically Yuval Harari's argument, is that all the things that we used to attribute to God, we can do now. So we basically, if the ancients saw us, they would call us gods. I don't know if this is helpful. I sometimes use the example like, I think we have gotten to be more like God because of our technology, but that's the same way of saying I'm not sure which direction I'm facing, but let's assume that Texas is that way, and I could say, I'm closer to Texas now, which technically is true. I have moved closer to Texas, but practically speaking, there's still a really long way to get to Texas. So I think probably every generation has said that. Hasn't our technology disproven the need for God? And then we break down and our mental health falls apart and the limitations impose themselves. And I think we maybe realize that we need God more than we realize.
Yeah, I would just add that the equipment to become godly has never changed. The
That's
gift of
right.
The Spirit and making of a new heart, that's been the best there ever has been.
And being godly and godlike are different things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, can we give Paul a hand? Thank you so much. I'll just close by asking Paul, if we want to learn more about this topic, what's a great way to do that?
Yeah, I've done some writing and podcasts. I have a blog and podcast called allthingsnew.tech, so you can go there. It's been a couple of years since there's a lot of new content, but one of the things I had done is sit down with Christian technologists in the Bay Area and just kind of talk about their technology and reflect theologically about the tech that they've created. And I enjoyed those conversations. There's about maybe a dozen or 15 of them recorded, so you could enjoy those. Again, more questions than answers, but I think it's an interesting conversation. So, yeah.
All right, thank you so much. And Paul, stick around maybe for a few more minutes
Yeah,
afterwards if you want to
for
chat.
sure.
Thanks again.
Thanks, y'all.